Slay the Spire is a roguelike deck-building game about climbing a mysterious tower, fighting strange creatures, and building a deck from whatever the game gives you. But after enough runs, another question starts to take over. What happened here? The Spire is full of temples, libraries, machines, tombs, strange creatures, and objects left behind by people we may never meet. The game never stops to give us a clean history lesson. There is no narrator who explains the rise and fall of the Spire from beginning to end. Instead, we get pieces. And because every run changes the map, the encounters, and the relics we find, no single climb gives us all of those pieces. If we want to understand the Spire's past, we have to remember what we saw, compare it with later discoveries, and build our own explanation. The first game hid its history in relic descriptions, short events, ruined places, enemies, and symbols. Then Slay the Spire 2 arrived, with new characters and a timeline full of additional fragments. Some older mysteries became clearer, other answers created even more questions. That is why I think Slay the Spire does something surprisingly historical. Its story is not only hidden in the setting, the game's fragmented design makes the player reconstruct the past in a way that is similar to the work of historians and archaeologists. First, it helps to understand why the roguelike structure matters. A run starts at the bottom of the Spire. You choose a route through a map filled with fights, shops, campfires, treasure rooms, and unknown events. If you die, the run ends and you begin again. Your deck disappears, but your knowledge does not. That last part is important. The character may return to the bottom, but the player remembers. I remember that one event can give a curse. I remember seeing a strange group in one act and an object linked to them in another. I begin to notice repeated symbols, similar machines, and places that look as if they belong to different stages of the Spire's past. Slay the Spire 2 makes this process visible through its timeline. Reaching milestones across many runs unlocks short entries called epochs. These fragments reveal pieces of the Spire's history, its inhabitants, and the playable characters, but they still do not arrive as one smooth documentary. The player earns them in pieces by playing. Even the community continues this process. The Slay the Spire wiki sorts events, relics, enemies, and dialogue into categories, while fan videos try to place scattered clues into a lore timeline. These are not official answers. They are interpretations built by comparing evidence, and different players can disagree about how the pieces fit. This is where the game starts to resemble historical research. Historians cannot travel back in time and watch the past happen. They work with what survived. Documents, objects, buildings, images, oral traditions, and sometimes tiny details that only make sense when they are compared with other evidence. Historian Carlo Ginzburg describes this as reasoning through clues. A small trace can point toward a much larger reality that we cannot see directly. A detail by itself does not tell the whole story, but several clues placed together can support an interpretation. That is also what we practiced in this course. When we compared Herodotus' different stories about Scythian origins, the goal was not simply to accept the first account we read. We had to ask who was telling the story, what evidence supported it, and why another version might be different. Camilla Townsend's work with Nahuatl sources also shows a different set of surviving records can change the history we are able to tell. Slay the Spire creates a smaller, fictional version of this problem. A relic description, a ruined room, an epoch, or an enemy design is not a complete history. It is a clue. The player's job is to decide what that clue might mean, connect it with other clues, and stay open to changing the interpretation later. The sequel is especially useful because it gives us new sources that can support, weaken, or completely change interpretations built from the first game. The ancient writing event makes this idea almost literal. The player discovers writing in an old building, but the game never translates it into a paragraph of lore. Instead, it gives two choices. Elegance removes a card from the deck, while simplicity upgrades every basic strike and defend. So the ancient text clearly has power, but its meaning is given to us through a mechanical change. We do not learn who wrote it, when it was written, or what the words originally meant. We experience the trace through what it does to our deck. The library works in a similar way. We enter a place filled with scrolls, manuscripts, and books. That sounds like the closest thing the Spire has to an archive, but the practical decision is still about surviving the run. Read and choose a card, or sleep and recover health. I like these events because they show how Slay the Spire communicates through play. The game does not merely tell us that knowledge is powerful, it turns knowledge into power we can use. Reading changes the deck, ancient writing improves or simplifies it, the history of the place is present, but we encounter it through a choice about our current needs. This is one reason Anna Maria Dragomir's idea of games as cultural texts is useful. In a game, meaning is not only in written dialogue. It can also appear through spaces, objects, random encounters, and the actions the rules allow us to take. Relics push the archaeological comparison even further. Material culture scholar Jules Prown argues that objects can be treated as evidence. A researcher begins by carefully describing an object, then considers how it might have been used, and finally develops an interpretation that can be checked against other evidence. Take Runic Pyramid. Its description says that the runes are indecipherable. That immediately tells us that there is a writing system in the Spire that our character, or at least the game's narrator, cannot read. The object survives, but its original meaning does not come with it. Then there is the mechanical effect. At the end of the turn, the player no longer discards their hand. That effect does not explain the pyramid's history. Still, it encourages questions. Why is this object linked to holding onto cards? Is the connection memory, preservation, planning, or simply a game mechanic with no historical meaning at all? That uncertainty matters. A good interpretation separates what the source actually shows from what we are guessing. The artifact is real inside the game world. The runes are unreadable. The relic has a clear gameplay effect. But any larger story I build from those facts is provisional. A new event, relic, or entire sequel could support it, weaken it, or point it somewhere else. The best example of new evidence changing an old interpretation is the Silent. In the first game, we knew that she was a deadly huntress from the Foglands. Her poison, knives, mask, and habit of collecting trophies suggested a culture and a past, but most of that past stayed outside the frame. The sequel adds crucial pieces. After the first climb, the Silent returned to her sisters with part of the heart as a trophy. She had been gone for centuries, and the blighted trophy began poisoning her. When the Spire opened again, she returned while searching for an answer to her sickness. This does more than add trivia. It changes how we read the first game. The heart is no longer only a final boss. It becomes an object with an afterlife, a trophy, evidence of the Silent's achievement, and a source of contamination. Her focus on trophies also becomes part of a longer personal story about status, memory, and what her community values. The new characters add different viewpoints. The Necrobinder is a Spire-born lich seeking revenge who fights beside Otsti, an enormous skeletal hand. The Regent is an outsider from the stars. They add more than decks. Their backgrounds change the scale of the story. This is how historical research often works. New evidence rarely replaces everything we knew. It fills some gaps, creates new connections, and makes familiar evidence look different. Slay the Spire 2 therefore acts like a newly opened collection added to an older archive. The fan timeline I used for this project is a perfect example of what players do with these fragments. Its creator, placeholder, compares relic descriptions, event text, character art, timeline entries, and even material found in the game's files, then arranges those pieces into one long chronological story. That work is impressive, but it is still an interpretation. The video marks some claims as unconfirmed, and several connections depend on visual similarities or guesses about where an event belongs. Turning scattered evidence into a smooth timeline can make uncertainty disappear, even when the sources are not that certain. For my video, that is not a weakness to hide. It is part of the argument. The fan timeline shows the same desire historians have to build a meaningful account from traces. It also reminds us to label the difference between what a source directly says, what several clues strongly suggest, and what remains speculation. But this is where the comparison becomes more complicated. Slay the Spire trains us to notice old objects, yet it also trains us to ask one question before every other question. Will this help my build? The Golden Idol event is the clearest example. We find a shining idol on a pedestal. The game calls attention to how valuable it looks, and taking it triggers a giant boulder trap. If we survive the trap, the idol gives us more gold for the rest of the run. The scene is funny and obviously borrows from the treasure hunter image of archaeology, But notice what the player is encouraged to think about. We do not stop to identify who made the idol, what it represented, or why it was placed there. We calculate whether extra gold is worth losing health, maximum health, or taking a curse. The mausoleum is even more direct. We enter a series of tombs and find a decorated sarcophagus. The writing on it cannot be read. Black fog leaks from the sides. We can leave the dead alone or open the coffin for a relic and risk becoming cursed. One version of the event even describes the player as taking the relic from the remains of a decorated soldier. These moments create the most interesting tension in the game. A relic can be evidence about the Spire's past, but it is also an upgrade. Once I pick it up, its main value is usually reduced to a number or an effect. More energy, more gold, more strength, more cards, or more health. Real archaeologists care about context. Where was an object found? What was beside it? Who created it? How did it move? Removing an object from its setting can destroy information. Slay the Spire usually does the opposite. It rewards us for removing the object and carrying it upward. It makes us curious like historians, but it often makes us act like treasure hunters. There is another limit to the evidence. Most of the people behind these objects are missing. We meet cultists, merchants, warriors, ghosts, machines, and creatures, but we rarely receive a normal account of how people lived in the Spire or how its different societies changed over time. Michel-Rolph Trouillot argues that history is shaped only by what gets recorded, but also by what is left out, lost, or silenced. An absence is not just an empty space waiting for us to invent an answer. It can show the limits of the sources and the power behind what survives. That idea helps us read the Spire more carefully. Its relic collection preserves weapons, idols, tools, books, masks, and machines, but whose everyday lives are not represented? Who built the city? Who maintained its machines? Who decided that certain objects were valuable? The game often cannot answer these questions, but this doesn't make the world building bad. In fact, the gaps are a major reason I think that the Spire feels mysterious. The new epochs answer some questions, but they also make the remaining gaps easier to see. Sometimes the honest conclusion is that the evidence is incomplete. So, does Slay the Spire actually teach players to be historians? Not completely. It does not teach archival research, dating methods, source languages, preservation, or the ethics of working with human remains. And because the Spire is fictional, every fragment was placed there by game developers, even when it is presented as an accident of history. But the game does teach a useful habit of mind. It teaches us to pay attention to small details, compare evidence across encounters, notice patterns, remember contradictions, and revise our ideas when a new clue or game appears. Most importantly, it makes uncertainty feel normal. We can understand more than we did without ever reaching a perfectly complete account. The roguelike structure is what makes this lesson work. If all the lore appeared in one encyclopedia entry, the player would simply receive the past. But because the evidence is scattered across changing runs, the player is forced to reconstruct it. Slay the Spire represents history as an archaeological puzzle. Its broken spaces, short events, relics, and changing maps never form one easy official timeline. Instead, they ask players to build a larger picture from pieces collected across many climes. That makes the game's replayability part of its historical meaning. Every new run is another chance to find evidence, test an interpretation, and notice something that did not seem important before. The player does not only learn about the Spire, the player learns how uncertain knowledge can be built. At the same time, the game turns ancient objects into rewards. We read the archive for cards, we open the tomb for a relic, we steal the idol for gold. The same systems that encourage curiosity also encourage us to strip objects from their context and measure them by usefulness. That contradiction is what makes the game so interesting from a historian's point of view. Slay the Spire makes us partly act like historians, partly like archaeologists, and partly like treasure hunters. We climb through a world whose past is everywhere, even though its complete history is always just out of reach. And then sooner or later, we die, return to the bottom, and look again.